Hello, Houston. As we start moving toward completing our analysis of the impact of perceptual processes on things linguistic, I want to continue our discussion of perceptual processes that we were dealing with last time, and probably most of what we're talking about today is going to deal specifically with that, although we will end, if we get a chance to get through everything, with a discussion also of consciousness, although we'll spend a lot less time on that as an area. I want to go back and pick up a couple of topics we introduced but really didn't get to explain a great deal in the previous lecture and talk some about them. So we're going to look at various kinds of attention and some of the extensions from that we barely mentioned last time, saccadic eye movement as a good example. But I also want to show you some demonstrations about what our eyes are actually capable of. And we will have a visitor at the end of the hour. Dr. Bruno Breitmeyer on the psychology faculty is going to come in and be with us for about the last 10 minutes of the lecture. And he has some truly mind-boggling, mind-confusing demonstrations to share with you, which will take advantage of the television. So you're going to want to sit close and look closely, because I guarantee you're going to miss some of what he presents. But that's the intent, is that you're going to miss it. He'll show you how to demonstrate that you're blind in a variety of ways. But I think it'll be an interesting kind of discussion of some of the role that perception plays in our linguistic ability here. So let's start off with an attention to, specifically attention and consciousness, as what's on the screen there. And we'll define for you, first of all, a term like selective consciousness, selective attention, I mean, okay? We defined it last time, is what I should have said, I guess. But that's what we're utilizing selective attention when we engage in something like dichotic listening, which is where you have different signals fed to each ear. I was talking about that last time in the early work by Cherry. And when participants in that original experiment are given permission to listen to only one of the messages that they are said to be engaged in, they are actually engaged in what's called shadowing. By what they're actually asked to do is to verbalize the message that is heard, but only that message. So here they've got two different signals coming into each ear, one into each ear. They're given permission to ignore the other one, simply ignore it. And then they're engaging in what is called shadowing, which is essentially looking at the nature of the mouthing off, I should say, verbally repeating the message that they hear. And even when they're instructed to attend only to the right ear, for instance, listeners could still track the semantic content of a message that started in the right, shifted to the left, and returned to the right. So even though they've been told to pay attention to only one ear, they can actually follow a message which starts in the other track, or in fact starts in the same track and wanders over to the other one. So the processing is done essentially unconsciously. They can simply follow the meaning without following the specific words that have been involved. But they could identify in that situation only the physical features, not the semantic content of the message that they weren't attending to. So here you've got two messages going in, one into each ear. You're given permission to ignore one because you're asked to focus specifically on the other one by shadowing it to the extent that you indicate what has been said in that situation. And yet all of a sudden we discover that you can actually track the semantic content of a message that started in one ear, shifted to the other, and jumped back. And you're not even aware of that shift that occurs. So whereas we've examined a lot of auditory phenomena like that one, visual selective attention can also be demonstrated, and quite powerfully, in a head-to-head clash of the physical features, physical factors that we see, to the extent that certain physical features with which we are practiced can oftentimes override other physical features. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is to show you a demonstration in the visual realm of what we've been talking about previously in the auditory realm. And so we've talked a little bit about semantic features, but we can also talk about physical features, not only in listening situations, but also in terms of what is called the Stroop test, which is what I want to share with you here. It's a classic example of the effects of selective attention. It was first mentioned about 3/4 of a century ago, actually in 1935, by John Ridley Stroop, after whom the test is now named. What you're going to do, I'm going to ask those of you in the studio here to participate in 3 tasks in order. If you would, I would ask that you turn the microphone on that you're on. Phil, can we turn on several mics simultaneously without blowing wattages? Okay, so we're going to ask all of you to just press the mic on. You will not be talking when anybody else isn't talking, so we'll be asking you to do one thing. But what I'm going to ask you to do, first of all, press the mic, make sure that each of you is on mic. That involves, there we go. Now we're getting full cooperation here. So what I'm going to show you first of all is a series of words. And I'm going to ask you to just read those words. We're going to put them on screen so that everybody can read along at home. As I point to them, I want you to read them. So I want you to go through in unison as rapidly as you can with me, pronouncing the words. Simply yellow, blue, orange, black. I'm going to start over again. I want you to go with me in unison. All right? Yellow, blue, orange, black, red, green, blue, yellow, red, black, green, orange, black, green, yellow, orange, blue, red. Very good. You've got 100 so far. You're doing fine. Let's try it in another dimension. Now what I'm going to ask you to do is simply read the color that is demonstrated here. Again, keeping the mic open so people can participate along with you. So here we go. Yellow, blue, orange, black, red, green, blue, yellow, red, green, black, orange, black, green, yellow, orange, blue, red. No great problem, right? Now let's put the two together. What I'm going to ask you to do, I'm going to show you words that are printed in color. And what I want you to do is not read the word, I want you to read the color of the ink in which the word is printed. Okay, so you're going to read the color of the ink itself. And again, speed is important. Do it as rapidly as you can. So here we go. Red, yellow,
green, blue, black, orange, black, red, yellow, blue, yellow, green, orange,
red, green. What is the matter with you? I wanted you to know that this is a test of neurological superiority that we've developed here. No, actually, it is a very powerful demonstration of a classic example of selective attention. That is, when you were asked to read the words, no problem. We could in unison read right through as fast as I could move the arrow. Same thing was true when we looked at the colors. You could name the colors very easily. It isn't quite as pure on the screen as it is maybe when you're holding a Crayola, but nonetheless, we had no trouble getting through it. And then all of a sudden, what I ask you to do is read the color of the ink rather than the word that's been printed there, and everything falls apart. Try as you will. You find yourself stumbling. And among other things, at least the impression that I get when I'm trying to do that test is that my mind is really fighting with itself, and I have to override the inclination to say the word, saying to myself over and over again, name the color, name the color. Well, that is a color name. No, read the color of the ink. And it turns out to be very difficult. Well, there are some theoretical demonstrations or predictions, explanations about what's actually going on there, especially in their native tongue. In our native language, reading is basically an automatic process. That is, it's not subject to voluntary control, and it's impossible to keep it from happening because we have practiced and over-practiced that skill so many times. When we see a word, we are essentially helpless but to read it. MacLeod in 1991 offers another rather interesting kind of parallel example. What he says basically is that the color word activates the pathway to say the word. That is, when you and I see print, we are urged on to read it. That's our first instinct, which is the wrong word to use there. That's our first response. And it's well practiced. It's a strong pathway. See a word, read it. But now what happens is that the ink color name activates another pathway. That is, name the color, as I told you. Okay? But it is not so strong a pathway because you don't practice it as much. It takes more time to gather the strength to name the color than it did to simply look at and name or read the word. And that's what you were struggling with. You were essentially gathering the strength there. So what you're seeing is an instance where you can actually sense the competition that's going on. That is, when you're in a task of selective attention, as is the Stroop test, you look at the words and it's so powerfully urged on you to read the word rather than rather than name the color, that the two get in competition with each other and they actually interfere with each other. When you've been told simply to name the color, which you can do very easily, when all of a sudden there's a thing that looks like a word, it's ever so tempting to go with the stronger response, name the word. So that competition is kind of involved, it's central to the issue of selective attention and what you're actually going to attend to at any given time. So let's move back and look at another form of attention in a slightly more limited way, and that is not the Stroop test, but rather what is called saccadic eye movement. The basis of that is the saccade itself, and the definition is showing up on the screen there, and that basically has to do with the rapid eye movement or shifting of the visual focal point that occurs when you and I are reading or viewing visual patterns or scenes. It's the movement of our eye across a particular page. And in fact, it involves, as you probably know, the fact that if you're just reading a newspaper column, you may, if you're skilled, be able to move your line right down the middle of the column, and you don't even have to change words at all. You don't have to move eye position at all. Just keep it in the center of the column and move it down. But on the other hand, if the movement of or the size of the print, the width of the print, is substantially wider, then what happens is that you actually will move your eyes from point to point, but in fact you don't scan each letter. Think about it a second. Reading is not truly a serial process in some ways. That is, when you're reading a headline or anything like that in the newspaper, you do not scan each word, translate the words into a word, go seek out the meaning, and so forth. Rather, your eye takes in that word and maybe one on either side of it at least. And so, in fact, you only hit maybe every third word in a typical, say, a wide print newspaper column or something like that. You may jump 3 or 4 words across in doing that kind of thing, and that is basically what's called saccadic eye movement. The saccades are the individual units that are made by which your eye jumps in that case. So understanding, to understand what's happening in this situation, we need to study a bit about the structure of the eye and the accuracy or interpretability of the visual information that the eye is pulling in for us at any given time. And so essentially what we're going to start with is the focal point. That is, that's where you're looking. So when I tell you to look at something, what I'm actually telling you to do is cause the image, wherever it is in the environment, to fall right on the center point of your eye. Okay? So focus on a period. The demonstration I gave you the other day has a related couple of things to it, and I wanted to go back, pick up on, remind you of what I demonstrated there, and then move past it for a couple of other points. One is that if you'll just take any particular period at the end of a sentence in the cognitive psych, the book, or anything else, if you look at that period, tell yourself to look at a dot or a spot or some very carefully defined space, the crossing between 2 narrow lines or something like that. What you find is that your eye actually wanders. It looks kind of in the general area of whatever you've instructed it to look at, but in fact it does not spend most of its time looking directly at that place, that point. It isn't particularly important in most instances. That is, it doesn't deteriorate our vision at all, because if you watch, I remember reading a story one time in a biological text about a flower that apparently opens once a year, and it has, I guess the structure of the flower, as I remember it, built up a great deal of internal structure so that when it released, the effect of that springing, which happened only once, was to scatter the seeds, which was the underlying adaptive mechanism that was involved by that. But the story had the person that wrote the article had a sidebar about his experience in doing that, and he had to watch about 3 years to actually see it happen. Because in essence, what happened was that, he blinked or he got distracted for just a second and looked away, and by the time he looked back, the seed had already exploded. So in essence, in general, the tremor on our eye, which is called, as I indicated last time, physiological nystagmus, does not work to the adverse, to the disadvantage of our vision at all, because we're looking in the general area of the scene that we're observing. And so even though the physiological nystagmus is laid on top of the saccadic movement of the eye, it isn't a tremoring object that can't focus at all, but rather one that is moving that way to keep, as I explained, to keep adaptation from occurring. So that you can't right now feel certain articles of clothing because you've had them on for so long that unless you happen to wiggle or move, you don't feel them at all. And in order to prevent that from happening in vision, we put that tremor, listen to me, the physiological nystagmus is part of the mechanism by which the eye prevents adaptation from occurring, the loss of signal that would otherwise occur. And there are demonstrations that have actually been done using a stabilized visual image in a very clever way. What they did was to put a mirrored contact lens on the eye, and then from a side source, they bounced a light ray off that mirrored contact lens, which caused it by that angle to move forward. They moved it through several mirrors so that it came straight back into the eye. So here's a light wave coming onto the eye, bouncing off a mirrored contact, taking off from the eye, out through several mirrors to line it up, so that exactly what would happen is every time the eye moved, it would cause the mirror to move, which bent the light ray slightly. So that basically the effect of the mirror on the eyeball and the bouncing that the light wave picked up in that way was such that the light beam was stabilized. So when the eye moved, so did the light beam. So the net result was that normally when I'm looking, for instance, at the edge of the desk where I'm lecturing, either the front edge or the back edge here, if I were to sit there and stare at it for a long period of time, it would not be particularly smart, a dumb-looking maneuver. But in fact, I wouldn't go blind. That would be particularly vital if you're at the top of a cliff or a staircase or anything like that, where you stare at your feet for a long length of time. You still need to know where that edge is when you are ready to move, maybe minutes later. So that's one of the roles of physiological nystagmus. And it does operate in all the senses, but physiological, the adaptation that is prevented by physiological nystagmus operates in the other senses. So you can't feel typically your watch unless you've moved your hand, your ring, and so forth and so on, simply because it's been on there a long time and it's not giving your body information that it really needs to pay careful, detailed attention to. So it fades away in our attention structure. Now, let's look also at the eye itself. Let's look at the structure of the eye itself and notice a couple of things about it. As I said, the area where you're looking is causing, that is when you adjust your eye to look at something, as I am to the television lens itself there, what I'm doing is causing that image to fall right on what is called the fovea. The advantage of that fovea is basically that it is covered exclusively with cones, which are color sensing elements on the surface of the eye. And the other thing that makes the fovea so good, in fact the main thing that makes it so good, is the fact that each foveal cell connects directly to a bipolar cell, which in turn connects synapses directly to a ganglion cell, which is part of the brain. So basically it's a one-to-one-to-one connection from stimulating cell to stimulating associated bipolar cell to stimulating a specific ganglion cell in the brain. And the result is that as those signals move back from the fovea with the very detailed representation back toward the back of the eye, the pattern is not lost. That is, each cell is reporting a particular color, texture, whatever it happens to be sensitive to. And so the fovea offers good, detailed vision, but it only covers a relatively narrow area. And I can demonstrate this in a couple of different ways. For instance, on screen, I'm going to put a diagram of basically what you're sensitive to. If we look at the screen, we can see a head. Focus on, I'm going to wait till we get that head on the screen because I need it for the purposes of what I'm going to talk about. There we go. In essence, that's the fovea. The fovea itself is only about 2 degrees wide. That is, if we follow that angle. Let me point out that the diagram here is centered rather than having 2 of them, which we normally do anyway, because we normally have stereo vision. For the sake of simplicity of diagramming and the fact that I couldn't do it on PowerPoint, I'm only going to show 1 rather than 2 images there. In addition, if we could diagram it more effectively, the light beams that I'm showing you there on the edge of the fovea would cross at the lens, so they'd hit the back of the fovea in reverse fashion. But that isn't relevant really to what I'm talking about here. What makes the fovea so good is that synapse is one-to-one from the sensing cone to the bipolar cell to the associated ganglion cell. But it's only good for about 2 degrees out from dead center. And in fact, the next area out, which is equally important, is what's called the parafoveal region. That stretches out about 10 degrees and really represents the outer limits of what your foveal vision really involves. That is, you cannot see detail beyond about 10 degrees out, and really the size of the detail has to increase the further out from dead center it is in this situation. That is, our sensitivity is gradually dropping. Because, of course, what happens, as you know, is that in the periphery, at the outer edge of the eye, we are coated, the inner edge of the retina itself is coated with rods rather than cones, which costs us two features. First of all, the rods are not color sensitive. They only react or don't react. That is, they react to degrees of gray, I guess, or degree of lightness would be a way to express it. So they fire, meaning white, or they don't fire, meaning black. And that's it. So if we move further out along the eye, what we find is that the near peripheral area is out about 60, it moves about 30 degrees out from wherever you're looking, so about 30 degrees either side of straight ahead. You're still in an area where there is some representation of cones, but there is ability to begin to sense the color of something, potentially with experience. I shouldn't overtalk here. But in general, you are fairly sensitive still to details, say about 30 degrees off dead center from wherever you're looking. And in fact, at the extreme, we go all the way around, and in fact, we have peripheral vision. Now let me show you, I'm going to use somebody with whom I've already arranged to do this, a short demonstration of the operation of our eye. If I can locate the pencil that I brought with me, which I need. Yes, I have. Can you come up front here for just a minute? We're going to shift over to a chair. We're going to give the team time to get over and focus on the chair. What I'm going to ask you to do is to look straight ahead, as if you're looking maybe at the bottom of the monitor over there or something like that. Keep your eye focused. What I'm going to do is to start over here on the side holding a pencil. I'll let you know what I'm actually holding. What I want you to do is tell me two things. I'm going to be moving my hand up and down, starting from way around here. And I want you to tell me, just say now, when you first see motion, you don't even need to know that it is a pencil, but just that you're aware that there's motion there. And then secondly, what I want you to do is guess the color of the pencil that I'm holding. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to give me two things. First of all, your guess about the color, and secondly, a confidence rating, running from 1 meaning I don't have a clue to 10 meaning I'm absolutely certain it is, whatever the color is. Okay? So, now you're going to look straight ahead. Again, let me remind you, it's very tempting to move your eyes. Don't do that, because the purpose here is to demonstrate something relative to eye position. I will show you the pen directly up front when we're ready to go. Okay? So, let me know when you're first aware that you can, I'm standing behind you now. Let me just move forward at eye level. When are you first aware that you see movement out here?
Now.
Okay? I'm actually about an inch behind her head at this point. So the diagram I was showing you a couple of minutes ago, where I showed you had 200 degrees of vision at eye height, is just about right. That is, you can literally see behind your head if the object you're looking at happens to be at eye level. Do you have any guesses to the color?
I have no idea.
Yeah, so that's a 1 I should infer.
Yeah.
I'll even give you a generous hint here. How about now? Don't dart your eyes, because it's
very...
not
to.
Okay, I know it's tempting.
I don't know what color it is.
Your course grade drops from an A to a C if you dart your eyes, and there'll be a lot of people looking to let me know. Okay? What color would you guess, if you had to guess?
Red.
Okay, and what confidence would you associate with that? 1, okay. Move a little further. What color?
I'd still say red.
And what color? Sorry, what number?
Maybe 2.
Okay.
Red, and I would say 5.
Okay.
I want to dart my eyes, I just didn't know it was red, but I
Okay.
kind of looked on accident.
Yep, okay, that's all we need. Thanks, you flunk. No, in essence, what she is, unfortunately, is a very astute observer at the edge of the cone. I've done that demonstration every time I do intros, so it's like 5 times a year, 7 times a year. And in some instances, you can actually get the cone within about that vision, that angle, before they will actually do red. And what usually happens, the reason for choosing red as the color is deliberate, and that is the rods normally do not fire to red. They simply interpret it as black. They are not sensitive to red. That's the reason that pilots who are on a scramble alert at night will wear red goggles, because in that case, when they go out into the dark, they can take the goggles off, and the rods are already adapted because they are already dark adapted, because they don't react to red light at all. So in that instance, she was sharp. It's unusual to have that much vision. I should have pilot tested you beforehand, I guess, before we do the vision. But try it with a friend. Take a red object, a red pencil, without letting them know what the color is, and move it forward. And you'll find in some instances you can get within about 5 degrees of straight on, and they still are. They will give you the red color eventually, but as happened there, the one thing that was predictable there was that the initial color the confidence rating was very low initially. She did say red, I was impressed, but her confidence was 1, and then 2, and then it jumped to 5, and then it jumped very rapidly up to the highest area as we moved into that area where the cones actually are. So there are a couple of different things that are being demonstrated there. One is the relative distribution of rods on the periphery, where we can see things, but we cannot see color. We can't perceive color. And then the movement toward the center, where additional features kick in as the number of cones goes up. So the cone-based vision is color-based vision, first of all, and secondly, allows us greater accuracy of identifying. That is, as the number of cones goes up, the confidence of rating of, gee, that's red, that's yellow, that's whatever, also goes up. The other thing I would point out is that in many situations in doing that demonstration, what I will find is that people tend to guess not red, but black or brown or purple. In other words, a dark color. Which is consistent with the idea that what the rods are reporting is essentially black, the absence of color in that situation. So in any case, let me go back to the visual that was on the screen a minute there and just point out again, because I wanted to actually demonstrate to you to convince you that in fact the vision at eye level is actually a full 200 degrees almost in most situations, and yet if you look straight up or straight down as much as you can, you're limited by your eyebrows and your cheekbone to about maybe 60 degrees. And I'm talking now when your head is square and you're looking straight at and then look down or look up. It's your eyebrows and your cheekbone that limit somewhat the visual field in that perspective. But in any case, we can convert that demonstration immediately back to reading. And the kind of demonstration that I would suggest to you is, in fact, let me suggest one other thing you might want to try. And that is, you can do that just sitting there watching me. Take your finger looking straight ahead. Don't move your eyes or your head. What I want you to do is move your finger out as far as you can until it just disappears. Right out wherever it does disappear in your visual field. When it goes out of sight, move it. At that position, move it up and down. Does it come back into vision at that point? Because theoretically what will happen is that when you're way out at the periphery, you're running out of cones at all being there. But one of the advantages, sorry, I said cones, I meant rods. You're running out of rods out at the periphery. But one of the advantages of having rods out there is that the way they connect to each other is there may be a 200 to 1, 500 to 1 collapsing ratio between a rod and the bipolar cells to whom it connects. And in turn, there may be a multiple to 1 connection ratio between bipolar cells and the individual ganglion cells. So the result is, if you get a ganglion cell to fire 2 levels up at the rod, there may be any of 500 cells that fired to actually cause that stimulation. The effect of that is that what it does is to make us more sensitive to movement out in the periphery of our visual field. So we can't detect color or shape at all, but we can detect movement in that situation. And again, it's simply demonstrated by if you move it out to just the point where your finger is disappearing and then move it, what you're doing then is causing that same image, which has just gone out of perceptual range, to be impacting a number of different cells simultaneously. Those accumulate, and all of a sudden you're aware that, yeah, there is something out there that's moving, even though I can't see exactly what it is. So in any case, let me show you another example of what I'm talking about. Well, in fact, we've got a demonstration on the screen here. If you get close enough to the television set so that you can focus only on some number of those letters, it may be easier to write out the letters that I'm talking about. It took me about 20 minutes to type these all out because I used all 26 letters without repeating. And if I switch that to a lowercase, and I'm not sure whether I had time to do that or not. I guess I did. Yeah, there we are. In the lowercase situation, you'll notice that if we had your nose, and I meant to draw a circle, but the middle letter is, let me count it in, 3, 6, 9, 12. So it's K and E. Between K and E are the midpoint of that range of letters. If you put those letters crosswise on a sheet of paper and then hold it up just a normal reading distance for you, a comfortable reading distance, if you focus, as I have here on the, I don't have an eye problem, I'm just reading close, but in any case, if you focus between the K and the E, in uppercase letters, it's a lot harder to pick out individual letters as you move out. With the lowercase letters, there is one additional factor which kicks in by way of experience that makes the job a little easier. And I deliberately, for instance, positioned the L about halfway out on the right side. And if you notice, even when you're quite close to a list of letters in lowercase, that L stands out, because it's particularly in the midst of other lowercase letters ranging from Z to V to G. It's buried in that group. That's one of those things that we can't specifically identify necessarily, but it is very likely to be a factor that contributes to what we're going to identify here later as semi-conscious or unconscious processing that you and I do as we're reading. So in essence, when we're looking straight ahead at a row of letters, we can very clearly identify whatever our vision span is and tell you exactly what the ones are in the middle. We lose a little bit of accuracy as we move out toward the outer ranges of the fovea, the parafoveal area. But we simply can't do it all the way to the end of the line. That's another reason why we have that saccadic eye movement, where we jump from position to position on a line. And it's estimated that we jump either 2 to 3 words apiece per jump, or about 10 to 20 letters in a given situation. 2 to 3 words or 10 to 20 letters is kind of the size of the jump that we make in that situation. But in essence, if you're using something like lowercase, we have the advantage that some of the letters are high, some of them hang down below the line, and all of those, even though we may not know precisely what letter we're looking at, it's already in our brain when we're reading pretty rapidly, cued certain words to be looking for, that we may be going into the L category to look for a particular word or something like that. So the saccades involve jumping 2 to 3 times a second as you're reading. Your eye is jumping 2 to 3 times a second. It involves less than 10% of the reading time. That is, as your eye is scanning across a page looking at letters, less than 10% of the time is involved is consumed by the actual jump from one to another position. The movement might be perhaps as much as the width of your extended foveal field, perhaps up to 10 degrees. And the movement in general is measured to last about 45 milliseconds, 45 thousandths of a second. But it does result in impaired vision, okay? And so the effects that are involved are things like visual smear. One of the things that happens is that the image that you're looking at is smeared, it's blurry. We don't get the effect as much anymore, but it used to be long ago when they broadcast football games at night where the light was just marginal as to whether the camera would work or not. When the camera would swing rapidly from one position to another in the stadium, you'd get a blurred image of what it was previously focused on, gradually fading away as the new image moved in. And that's essentially what your eye does. The movement of the eye creates what is called a visual smear. But it straightens up very rapidly. That is, most of your time is not occupied by smear, but rather by the details of the image that you happen to be looking at. The puzzle for those that are studying reading is often not clearly perceived, yet it is frequently clearly encoded. The object of what we're studying is essentially very fuzzy in its perception, and yet the encoding of it is crystal clear. You read a passage, you know what it said. And that's a problem. That's an interesting problem, because it means that our selection and decision processes are going on very rapidly on remarkably little information, or less than what is a full load of information that is offered when you take time to study a particular book. And that is going on in fractions of a second. In fact, that whole process is being repeated as much as 3 times a second. It's really a phenomenal process. When you look at the act of your eye just skipping across the page, you're extracting the knowledge from it and able to learn by virtue of that. So that leads us then into one of the major things we're going to spend time on here today, and that is looking at various theories of focused attention. The classic in this area was proposed by Donald Broadbent in what came to be known as a filter model back in 1958. Some argue, in fact, in this case, that it traces from ideas that were stimulated by Cherry's work several years earlier, back around the middle of the century. It was the first theory, Broadbent's that is, was the very first theory to use a flowchart approach to trying to diagram what was actually what was actually being discussed here. And it was arguing that information is basically modified as it flows through a number of stages. It enters in one stage, obviously visual images or the lettering that you've listened to, the language that you've listened to. But it changes then into knowledge, which can be stored in one way or another. Incoming stimuli are envisioned in terms of the sensory memory, which we're going to discuss in the next pair of lectures when we get into looking at memory. And though Broadbent expressed his model in terms of vision, there is a parallel form of memory in the oral senses, hearing. The one I'm referring to specifically is the fact that in iconic storage or sensory storage, when an image hits your brain and then is taken away, it stays there for just fractions of a second, during which one theory of memory argues that a scanning process takes place so that the image can then be lifted into short-term memory if you're attending to it. But that same process turns out also to exist in oral phenomena. Give you a very specific and easy example. If I were to say to you the word electroencephalogram, you have to hold that entire word in memory until you hear the very last phoneme, the before you know that I'm talking about that, rather than the machine itself. That is, I'm talking about the output, the record, rather than the machine itself, which I would be if I used a word like electroencephalograph. And the only difference between the meaning of those two words, and it is quite different, one's the output, the other is the measuring device, is determined by the or the f at the end of the word that I'm using there. It has to be held in some kind of short-term storage until you hear the last sound in order to translate it into the proper meaning, the intended meaning. And in fact, it shows up in a number of different senses. If you were to take and drag your hand across a sharp edge, as I am my hand on the edge of the monitor there is, if you do that on the edge of the chair that you're sitting at or the edge of a table or something, you will notice that there is an image, just a very faint image of what you've already passed that is still residing in your skin sense, in your sense of touch. It remains there for a very short period of time. So that held image effect is there in many different phenomena, even though we're going to be limiting ours to looking specifically at visual and verbal information. Broadbent basically asserts that at the next stage, the incoming stimulus is analyzed in terms of its physical characteristics, as I discussed them earlier. Things like voice tone, frequency or pitch, rhythm, features that include speed and stress and so forth. Suppose you're listening to your father. You know these features of his voice. That is, you recognize him when he calls on the phone, offering no visual image at all, but you still know that it's him that you're talking to. This message is let through. The physical feature of him in that voice is let through that filter, according to Broadbent, but everything else is blocked by the filter. That is, you're attending to him when you're talking on the phone. So the authorized attended message is passed to the detector, which analyzes higher level features such as meaning. And so the model that we're going to suggest is operating like this. The word stimulus is over on the left side of the screen, and that in turn is registered on the sensory registers, whatever it happens to be. Since we're reading, let's talk about vision as the input channel. The eye is stimulated. In turn, what Broadbent argues is that this incoming information goes directly into the selective filter. And what comes out of there is a seriously edited passel of information, cluster of information. In that case, it has a very limited capacity to pass information onward. And in fact, that is the information which then leads to a response if you recognize what's happened, or in other cases, it may lead to a detecting device to look at the meaning of what's been represented, and in fact there may also be an interaction with short and long-term memory depending on what's involved there. But those are the processes that are involved. A very simple, straightforward model. Okay, this is called an early selection model. Okay, 2 undergraduates, I keep saying okay a lot, okay? But it didn't tend to fit the data very well. The problem was it was actually 2 undergraduates at Oxford who came up with a really interesting kind of experiment that was a kind of an in-your-face attempt to test Broadbent's model, and the model simply flunked. But in essence, what the key element in this, as Broadbent originally proposed it, is the filtering that goes on when the incoming information goes through that selective filter. That is attending only to physical features. And in fact, what comes through there, based on your analysis of those physical features, are only the things that you're trying to listen to. Now, you can see here, what I'm headed toward is an explanation for selective attention. That is, in this case, if you're listening to both your mother and your father talking, or maybe your brother and sister in the background talking at home, your mother talks to you or your father does, and it's your intent to listen to that message through to the point where you understand what you're being asked or being told. Excuse me. This is an example of where that works. That is, in that case, the selective filter, according to Broadbent, simply blocks out your brother's and your sister's conversation. It doesn't get processed beyond the point that you recognize it's one of them that's talking, not the message you're interested in. Your mother's voice, if that's whom you're listening to, is let through in the limited capacity channel. Meaning is attached to it, and eventually you either respond or the information is fed into short or long-term memory, depending on how long it's going to be stored. As I said, the data didn't support it. Okay, 2 undergraduates at Oxford did a very simple experiment. They simply had, using the dichotic listening situation that Cherry had used, what they did was to design an experiment, a tape, a stereo tape, that had information on one side and a different set of information on the other side. It had previously been demonstrated that it was possible to listen, for instance, to numbers like 7, 9, and 4 on the left side, and numbers like 1, 6, and 9 on 1, 6, and 8 on the other side, different set of numbers, and pair them off, call them either. It was interesting. It's an aside comment, but I think it's relevant here. What Broadbent had demonstrated was that if you did that, if you were fed in 3 pairs of numbers in not a rush, just once a second or something like that, the way that subjects tended to report it out was to read off all of what went in the left ear first, or one ear, like 7, Aunt, 4. And then read off what went into the other ear, such as dear, 9, Jane. Okay? If you had to do it by pairs before you could do the next pair, now you were required to do 7, dear, Aunt, 9, and 4, Jane. It turns out to be a lot more difficult to do that. That is, the reaction time is a lot slower when you're asked to read them off as pairs. That is, you have to integrate left and right. Excuse me again. So Broadbent essentially concluded from that correctly that it's tougher to change channels than it is to simply continue to attend to the information in a given channel. On that basis, then, he was very enamored of that channel idea. That is, that you could focus your attention on one channel. But look back at the screen here and let me show you what happened. When the 2 undergraduates at Oxford actually did this, what they found was that the subjects would often report out this kind of a situation. That is, what they tended to feed out as a meaningful message was Dear Aunt Jane. I'm sure the undergraduates chose that message very specifically to demonstrate the point. But that's very hard for Broadbent's model to explain, because it's clear in that case that it requires that the participant has been actively attending to both ears. Even though he may have been instructed, she may have been instructed to attend only to the left ear or only to the right ear, the information from the other ear slips over, and semantically you get a fully integrated message. Dear Aunt Jane. Interestingly enough, subjects often couldn't even indicate how they'd done it. Not only that they'd done it, but how they'd done it. That is, they were unaware that in fact they had scrambled the channels so that they got a consistent message about Dear Aunt Jane, when in fact Aunt Jane was split in 2 different areas. Initial research just using letters and free order of recall again suggested that they tried to do all of them in one ear and then all of them in the other ear. So this was not a pleasant surprise for Broadbent. It didn't fit well with his theory. Dear Aunt Jane was a real surprise, indicating that the supposedly blocked material in the other ear had been processed enough to detect continuous flow of information from one ear to the other and back again. That finding cannot be supported by Broadbent's model. It just won't work. So that in turn led to a flurry of models. We're going to go through each of them today. Hopefully we'll have time to get through all of them. But essentially Anne Treisman, now at Princeton, proposed a slightly different modification of the model. In this theory, what she's done is to acknowledge that selection may take place in 2 stages. So Broadbent's initial filter is changed from a filter which attenuates the relative detectability of incoming stimulation. Let me say that again. Broadbent's filter, which is a blockage model, basically is changed to an attenuation model. That is, it modifies, but it doesn't totally block information. And we can see that in the model as it's proposed. So the stimuli, again, are on the left. They generate impact, that is, they impact the sensory register, which in turn registers on the attenuation control. And so in this case, what's called the attenuation control in this particular model. Okay? But it lets some of that information through. So the attended message gets a free ride through. The one that the person is attending to gets a free ride through. All of its important features are processed. But the other messages are filtered based on their physical characteristics, such as the features like loudness and pitch. It analyzes in terms of patterns suggesting speech or music. How does the sequence create, for instance, meaning across the sounds of words? That's another way in which it can be integrated. And this enables one to filter in terms of the language, assigning meaning to incoming sequences. Which language is it? French, Spanish, English? What are we listening to? The other messages are weakened, but the processing progresses. So in essence, what comes out of there into that capacity, that limited capacity channel, is the one message is allowed through completely. That's the one that you're attending to, but there may be certain other features of other information that's available that also gets processed in this particular model. So the identification of incoming material is processed long enough to identify the meaningful message. This may be achieved in some cases with physical features, volume, or the sex of the person talking, or the tone of voice that they're using. But on the other hand, it may require further analysis of the meaning. So there may be some back and forth that's going on there. But this essentially becomes a selective early or middle selection filter. That's basically what Treisman has proposed here. Some have even called this a leaky filter, because it's actually letting information through that might otherwise, according to the Broadbent model, would have been simply stopped. Okay? So gaining access to the detector unit is the second stage. This unit is essentially a dictionary of the listener's vocabulary, stored in such a way as to reflect past experience. Okay? And so in this case, the information moves into that detecting device where meaning may be assigned. On the other hand, there may be an exchange of information into short-term memory so that it can be processed further, or even long-term memory for more long-term storage in that situation. What's basically involved here is that our own name, for instance, has a very low threshold. It's set perhaps at that low threshold of sensitivity, the filter is highly sensitive to it, but the rejection rate is very low of our own name, probably through practice. You've used it so many times that it is a highly familiar stimulus, and when you hear it, it just zips right through that system, as proposed by Treisman. Unknown words have a much higher strength of signal that is needed to get through the filter system in this case. It provides a nice model to explain the difference between, for instance, our active and our passive vocabulary. We'll come back to a slightly different version of that later, but as you know, or you may not know, the vocabulary that you and I use in talking to each other, not in an academic class, whether it's psychology or business or engineering, you're being hit with a lot of new terms. That's part of what is involved in introducing or talking about a discipline. You're learning new words, new vocabulary items, and so forth. But on the other hand, when you and I talk to friends about this, that, or the other thing, we use a much more limited vocabulary. That is our active vocabulary. It's the words that we normally use. On the other hand, we have a much larger, what is called passive vocabulary. Okay? You may not use a word like fragmentary very often. You just talk about parts or broken into parts. That's part of the active vocabulary versus passive vocabulary distinction. But if you're reading, the passive vocabulary is right there. You may be reading words that you know, you understand, you just don't use them all the time. That's the distinction between the active and the passive. And that processing capacity of the Treisman model begins to introduce the idea that we might be able to make a distinction based on that. That is that the relative signal strength of any given word is largely what limits it either to active or passive vocabulary. That's an aside, but it's interesting. So this ability to make later selection is why this might be called a medium selection model. It's kind of the selection is further through the overall process of processing the information, of analyzing the information. But there's a remaining problem here, and that is puns. If you are a sentence ending in a pun, what happens is that your processing may actually have to almost start over again, because you realize suddenly in processing and then attaching words meaning to one of the latter sounds or sentences in a pun, latter words in a pun, you realize all of a sudden as you're processing, oh, wait a minute, there's another meaning there. And that is one of the reasons that when you are in an audience listening to a comedian who uses puns, oftentimes, if you'll notice, there is a long latency between when the pun occurs and when the first laughter occurs. Because in fact, what's happened is the personnel, people listening to it, have had to process it, pick up the word that then has, oh, wait a minute, there's another meaning. And in reprocessing it and recognizing the implications of that other meaning, then all of a sudden the humor is sparked and the laugh occurs. But it's actually showing the delay of the processes that are kind of fundamental to Broadbent's and Treisman's model here. We'll go through a couple of others here fairly quickly. And this, as I saw, I guess I should have showed you earlier, but that's Treisman's model. There's another one, which is a late model, not as in a car, but developed more recently by the Deutsch people. I don't even know whether they're brothers or not. May just be married investigators. But in any case, they come up with a slightly different model, okay? In so many words, basically, what their model does is to move the initial filtering of physical properties until later in the processing sequence. So for them, the sensory registers are impacted, which in turn goes through perception, but all of it is processed. A significant amount of the information in this case is processed. So this allows the initial processing of meaning, such as was proposed by Treisman, but later in the sequence. Okay, so the selection filter can still be used to attach meaning to the item that is being processed, but it's later in the sequence. So that allows an explanation of how messages that are not supposed to be attenuated or attended to nonetheless are perceived. That is, in this particular model, all of the messages are carried all the way through to the point where meaning is attached, and if the meaning is positive, in that case it gets passed forward and allows the integration of Dear Aunt Jane from two completely different channels where you're instructed to attend only to one of them. That's the Deutsch late model, essentially. And then we have also another model that evolved out of that, going in a slightly different direction. We seem to have basically combined the processes in every possible combination, but there are a couple of more that can be used here, and yet we're moving toward a fairly decisive explanatory model in one more step here after the Johnson-Hines model. What they did was to propose 3 stages. The first is similar to Broadbent's idea. That is, the stimuli are basically impacting a sensory register. That is referred to as stage 1. So the stimuli go through a sensory register and process the sensory aspects of what is involved. Stage 2 is going on simultaneously. I'm a little disappointed in a way that they measure it as, or label it as stage 2, because that implies seriality where it isn't. There isn't any. So that basically what happens here is that the stimuli are processed in 2 ways, more or less simultaneously. You see we're moving toward the parallel distributed processing that Matlin talks about a great deal here. And in this case, stages 1 and 2 are conducted largely without awareness. You and I are not aware that the process is going on. But in stage 3, if we're concerned with Broadbent processes, those represent a message or a decision that is made at stage 1. That is, if the information can be analyzed at the sensory level, the stage 1 supplies the information as necessary. Whereas most of the later decision models are represented or represent stage 3 in conscious decisions. That is what this moves toward. All of the sensory and the detecting device meaning association information is fed into a decision filter where you make a decision about what you're listening to, what words you've heard, and so forth. And in that case, a response will actually occur. And this is the multimode model theory of Johnston and Hines. But in this case, what they're arguing essentially is that if the decision is made, it may be made in some cases very rapidly based on the sensory processes of the data, but it can also be made with equal rapidity if it happens to be based on the meaning. the semantic features of the data. There is some other data that will come to disagree with that, because the processing of meaning tends to take a lot longer than the processing of the physical features, but we'll talk about that more later. But in any case, this is a model that postulates stage 1 is sensory, stage 2 is semantic, but they may occur at the same, they do occur at the same time, and the information then is fed to stage 3, where the decision itself is ultimately made, leading to whatever response is appropriate in this situation. Now, basically, having looked at doing perceptual processes first, last, or somewhere in the middle, what we end up with is a couple of different ways to summarize what's been done here. Ulrich Neisser, one of the founding fathers of grandparents of modern-day cognitive psychology, hypothesized, try to get it all out there, hypothesized the existence of two distinct processes which are actually controlling what we're attending to. One of these are what he called pre-attentive processes. They're essentially analogous to the sensory registers and the meaning detection that we were talking about in the Johnston-Hines model just a minute ago. These processes are automatic, they're unconscious. They occur rapidly, and they deal with the physical features of the incoming stimuli. Okay, these pre-attentive processes occur in parallel. They're all going on at the same time. On the other hand, Neisser also hypothesized the existence of attentive processes. These are the control processes, these are the processes that control what occurs later. They are conscious, and they consume resources or capacity as they operate in serial fashion. Across all these theories, as we've suggested them, it is clear that there are two distinct processes that have been identified. One of these are the physical and semantic features of the, well, both of them are the physical and the semantic features of the information that we're dealing with here. Some of these analytic processes occur consciously, with limits as to how much can be done simultaneously. Others occur without conscious awareness and seem to occur in parallel. That is, they can occur at the same time. McCann and Johnston, same Johnston as we were talking about earlier, suggest that judging of physical differences in stimuli occurs much faster than judging of semantic differences in stimuli. Psycholinguists and those who study the cognitive processes of language, attention, and problem solving have moved away from these traditional filtering or blocking models toward models that put much more emphasis on the features they're dealing with, specifically the capacities of the processing channels. Let me say that again, because I may have jumbled it, and that is, the early models were filters. What occurs at what level and what that enables as a subsequent process. The newer models that people moved toward were those that featured the limits that are imposed on us by our processing limits, how much we can attend to at any given time. Very simple way to illustrate it for yourself. If you take a younger brother or sister and spread out some M&Ms on the table, just put them out in a circle of about 8 or 10 of them, and put 6 or 7 or 8 well within Miller's plus or minus 2 capacity. And what you find is that when you look at those, when your young brother or sister looks at it, the information is there and gone. I mean, they can look at it, look away, and they can tell you immediately how many are there. Okay? But in the case where you overload them, where you give them 12 or 15 or 18, what you have in that case is they're not able to do it. And that's a channel capacity problem. They're just not able to process all of the information simultaneously. And we also know that such processes can get tired as you do them. All right? And what that's leading to is some other features that we will need to look at here a little bit. And that is basically, let me just at least finish up selective attention here. Think about the anxiety. What I'm leading to is the idea that some of the things that we do to ourselves impact, even though we may have these nice theoretical models, some of these things impact how we are actually able to use the various recognition and attention models and so forth. Think about the anxiety that you generate in yourself at a test. If you're marginally prepared, you then tend to create all sorts of drive in yourself, pressuring, not helping your performance in any particular way. Or think back to the Stroop effect that we were looking at a little bit earlier. And suppose basically that a person has a phobia with spiders. This is one of the incredible ways in which this test has been expanded out of its initial cognitive base. And that is that it is now known that if you have a phobia, for instance, sit down somebody who has phobia about spiders, If you then put them through the Stroop test, you can measure differentially their reaction time to saying a colored word or saying the colors of words as they're printed. It turns out that if those printed words include words like crawl, web, and hairy, all of which relate to various kinds of spiders, surprisingly enough, it slows their reaction time. So that what's happening is that you can even use this test in very subtle ways. That is, what I'm suggesting is that we're just kind of scratching the surface of what cognition is really getting at when we're isolating the various individual effects of selective attention. Now we have a guest with us who's stopped in and visiting today. And what I'm going to do, since we're at the break point between selective and divided attention, I'd like to introduce to you a special guest by the name of Bruno Breitmeyer. I'm strangling myself on my cord here this morning. Okay. If you want to sit down and put the screen onto, just go to escape and move that off. Your stuff is down at the bottom of the screen.
Let's see.
The bottom two demos.
Oh, they're already there. Okay.
Yes, they're loaded and ready to go.
Okay, so I can start with this here. We want to go to the top, though. And
do you want to
show slideshow? No, here we go. View show. There we are. Okay.
Alrighty.
So this is what I'll talk about.
Okay.
Is visual object perception. That's sort of the front end of visual cognition. You have to be able to perceive objects in order to know what they are. We're going to talk about how does a brain or mind actually do it. How does a brain or mind work when it perceives objects? And we're going to talk about very simple objects, as you'll see. And there are several research strategies that you can adopt. You can compare visual processing when an object is visible, in other words, when it's perceived, to when it is rendered invisible in some way. Okay? That's one way of doing it. And how do you make this comparison? Well, that's the question. The first answer is you can take healthy individuals like you and me and take neurological patients that have some kind of brain damage that doesn't allow them to see objects in one way or another, and you can then, by studying them, try to find out, the different parts of the brain that might be involved in object perception. Okay. But you can also, in a second approach, you can also compare visual processing in healthy subjects like you and me. When she or he sees an object, to the case when she or he is temporarily blinded to the object. Okay, I can actually render you temporarily blind to seeing a stimulus or an object. All right, and we can then compare what happens under those two circumstances. And how does one temporarily render a healthy human subject blind? Okay. Well, vision researchers like me, we've developed a little over, I would say close to 8 techniques or ways of doing that. All right? And I'll just mention, I won't even mention them. I don't think that pays because it wouldn't be informative. But I'm going to talk about 2 such ways here, okay? And demonstrate them actually. A colleague of mine who's at Vanderbilt University talked about these ways as being psychophysical magic, making things disappear from view, although they're physically still present. Okay? So I'm going to talk about this way. It's called motion-induced blindness, and that's one of several, let's say 8, 6, 7, 8 ways of doing psychophysical magic. I'll have to get out of the PowerPoint here and go to the other demo now. Is this?
Should be the other one on the bottom there.
Ah, yeah. extract all. See if it works. No, that's not the one I want. Sorry. Is it this one here? Ah, yeah. What I want you to do is look at the center of the display for a while and notice what happens to those 3 yellow dots. How many of you get one or two of the dots disappearing? Okay? They're still there. Physically, they're still there. But this moving background, this blue moving background, causes the disappearance of 1 or 2 of the dots. If you keep looking, try to fixate the center of that notional triangle. Maybe not move your eyes, try not to move your eyes too much. Ooh, I got all 3 of them disappearing now. 2. All right? This is known as motion-induced blindness. How many of you got that effect? All right, most of you, hopefully. And what vision researchers can do, and visual neuroscientists, they can put you inside, let's say, an fMRI scanner, you know, functional magnetic resonance imaging, and they can see what parts of the brain light up when you see the 3 dots, and what compared to when you don't see them or when 2 of them are not seen. And then by subtracting the fMRI images, they can tell you what parts of the brain specifically light up when you do see the stimulus. And those parts of the brain are then correlated with your conscious perception. Do you see? That's the gist of that. I'm going to talk about another technique that I use in my lab. It's another way of doing psychophysical magic. Let's see, from current slide. Well, all right. Let's go through this real quick. And it's called masking. And in this particular task, you present very briefly a little target stimulus, let's say a disk, and then at varying onset asynchronies. SOE stands for stimulus onset asynchrony. That's a time interval between the onsets of the 2 stimuli. Okay?
So we're looking at a timeline there.
Yeah. This duration might be only 10 milliseconds right here, and this might be only 10 milliseconds here. And then this is variable from 0, let's say, to 200. Is that clear? And we look at the visibility of some aspect of the visibility of the disk as a function of the delay of the surrounding ring. Okay? And I'm going to demonstrate this to you. The first, I want you to fixate the fixation cross. The stimulus, the target, and this, the disk and the surrounding ring should appear somewhere up here. But by fixating here, you get a stronger masking effect, as we call it, and the phenomenon is much more profound if you don't look directly at the stimuli. So the first slide is one in which the 2 are presented simultaneously. In other words, the asynchrony is 0 milliseconds, okay? And you should clearly see a disk inside a ring, all right? Are we ready? How many of you saw the disk inside the ring? A black disk inside the ring, okay? Now, look at the fixation cross again. And now you might have seen it a little bit, but you saw it a lot less distinctly. And here, I didn't see it at all. Okay, I know something was there, but I didn't see a clear dark disk. And now as I increase the time interval, it'll become clearer and clearer again. There I saw it fairly clearly.
So what you're doing is increasing the time between the disk and the surrounding.
The onset of the disk and the onset of the ring, okay? There, very clearly, right? There very clearly, and there very clearly. And so if you plot the stimulus onset asynchrony here versus target visibility, what you find is that target is very visible when they're presented simultaneously, or when the mask is presented way after the target. But in between, you can basically reduce the visibility of the disk to close to 0. Okay? And so what we can do is we can actually, using these kinds of paradigms, study the time course of object perception also. Okay? How a clear percept evolves over time. And we can also use that technique to look at what happens in the brain. In fact, a version of this technique has been used, again using functional magnetic resonance imaging to look at where in the brain a stimulus registers visibly, if you will, in terms of the correlated neural activity. All right? So you get an fMRI when only the mask is visible and the target is not, and then you get an fMRI for the case where both of them are visible. You subtract one from the other one, and that tells you, what part of the brain lights up when the disk becomes visible. That's the general. It's more complicated than that, but that's the rationale behind that. Okay, now let's look at visual objects. Visual objects are defined by a contour or a boundary and by surface. Okay? Forget about these specific details. I'm using a particular model by a fellow named Stephen Grossberg. He's at Boston University. And according to him, the first part of object perception has to do with what he calls a contour sketching process by which the visual system determines where the edges of the object are. So, for instance, and he calls that the boundary contour system. Okay? For instance, suppose the object is this cyan square on a gray background, right? The boundary contour system lets you know where the edges are only, lets you know nothing about the surface. In other words, the color property, okay? Because the surface has a feature to it which is a particular color. And that computation of edges and boundaries of an object is done implicitly, non-consciously. You have in your brain a non-conscious representation, if you will, of the outline of an object without actually seeing it, of the boundaries of an object. Now, subsequent to that, you fill in the surface attributes, okay? So, and that's what he calls a feature contour system. In other words, that's the feature that fills in between the contours, all right? So, at this stage, you only have the boundary information present, but then the filling in occurs, and bam, now the contours are explicitly, consciously present. You can now see the edges, actually, as well as the surface. So you see, seeing the form of an object requires seeing the surface properties also, like color, lightness, and so on, all right? And what I've done, what I did recently, I just want to go briefly through a certain study that I did that shows that these two parts of object perception, those two aspects, have different temporal characteristics. Okay? It turns out that the contour information can be processed faster than the surface information. And this is the way we did it. We had a task in which we presented a target stimulus like this black disk, and it was presented simultaneously with a matching with another disk whose lightness, the level of gray going from pure white to 100% black, could be varied, okay, by the subject. So what we then did is we varied the time interval from 0 to 200 milliseconds between the onset of the target and the onset of the surrounding mass, just like in that prior demonstration, okay? And for each of those intervals, time intervals, we had subjects adjust the comparison stimulus until it appeared to be just as bright, if you will, or as light as, or as dark as the target that appeared to them. So if the target was completely masked, if it was totally invisible, you would set this value to white. Okay? On the other hand, if the target was totally visible, then this value would be set to completely black, you see? So here you're getting at the surface properties. And then in the second task, we had the very same stimuli pretty much, except for the following. The target could have a contour deletion in the upper part, okay? Or else in the lower part, which I haven't shown, or it could be a complete disk. And now the subject, after each trial, had to indicate by pressing one of 3 buttons as to which of those 3 they thought they saw on that trial. It's called a 3 alternative forced choice procedure. And then what you find is that if there's suppression of the contour information, right, then you should make more errors in identifying, correctly identifying, or making your correct choice. Does that make sense? All right. And then we varied the time interval between the onsets from 0 to 200 milliseconds. And this is what we found. We get this typical U-shaped function that I showed previously. But for the contrast matching procedure, the optimal suppression was when the ring followed the target by 40 milliseconds. For the contour information, the optimal suppression occurred at a delay of 10 milliseconds. And what that says is that contour information is processed about 30 milliseconds faster than surface information in object perception, okay? At the non-conscious level. And in fact, something interesting happens here. Here you can actually see surface properties, but you do not see very well the contour properties. I was one of the subjects. I often run myself in these experiments, and what you find is, suppose that the target stimulus was actually a complete disk. What you would find is that you might see something like this. The contour is partially masked. We're done. And we're done. Okay?
Pretty close, but you can go ahead and finish it up.
But anyway, you know, here the contour is partially masked, and you can see why you might call this stimulus, you might designate that as one that's missing the upper contour, okay? Although it physically has the entire contour. Here, you might see something like that, and now it's hard to decide whether the upper contour or the lower contour is missing, okay? Physically, because perceptually you have both the upper and lower missing. But you still have some semblance of the feature being filled in, okay? In other words, the stimulus is not seen as dark as it actually is, but it's still seen as having darkness between the contours that do exist perceptually, okay? So this is one way of actually looking at, on a millisecond scale, how the visual system is processing objects when it does the task of object perception, object recognition. All right.
This is what happens when you invite a bright person expecting one thing and you end up getting 3. We've run out of time.
Yeah.
In any case, thank you very much,
You betcha.
Professor Bruno Breitmeyer.